Today we're talking about tips for successfully using cover crops in heavy clay soils. And when you think about all the different conditions that that cover crops are used, all the different soil types. And last week we talked about in dry land areas with less than 20-inch rainfall. This is kind of almost an opposite type discussion here, where we talk about heavy clay soils, which tend to be on the wet side. Not always, but tend to be on the wet side. And one thing that's interesting when you think about the whole dynamic of cover cropping, and we talk about this routinely, is that there are certain principles that apply to almost any situation. Some of those big picture type principles that we talk about. And so I'm not just copying, pasting from what I did last week, although there is some similarity there and there's some similarity for some other things. But we want to hone in here on heavy clay soils because I don't know what the percentages are out there, and there's a pretty broad definition of what heavy clay soils are. But we're talking about those soils that tend not to dry out as quick, maybe are a little bit more difficult to manage. But they really shine when we get into the drier situations. If they're managed right, they can really hold water for a long time. And that helps them then produce some pretty impressive yields. So it's kind of, I'm just going to say this on the outset, it's kind of like knowing how to manage around some of the challenges in the context of cover cropping is what we're going to be focusing on today. And I want to give you some ideas of how you can do that. So again, I think feeding the biology is one of the key components we always need to think about with cover crops, and certainly in heavy clay soils. And so when we think about feeding the biology, basically the diversity of species is going to enhance that. I mean, you kind of, in a way, you get out of the system what you put into it. And I think that's important to be reminded of that. And then again, another very basic principle, we want to try to have something growing year around. And that is our goal. And that is what we want to try to do. And I want to give you some suggestions of how to do that. But again, water management is key. But here for heavy clay soils, infiltration applies to almost every soil, but the drainage component, being able to drain them, but yet in a balanced way, having the soils be healthy enough so that they can actually hold water. So that's kind of a fine line how that all actually works. But I'm just saying that cover crops is going to address that, and they're going to really help that dynamic of water infiltration, water storage, and water drainage. It's going to be better when you can get a cover crop planted or having living roots in the soil year round. So that's why it's just important to keep some of these concepts in front of us as we think about. So, but let's adjust some expectations here. Just because you plant a cover crop doesn't mean your wet spots are going to instantly disappear, or you'll be able to plant corn as soon as the snow melts on a heavy clay soil. Okay, so I'm using this picture to make a point that what is feasible and so forth. And there's a lot of variability goes into that. I would say, first of all, just what is your knowledge of your fields, and what is your knowledge of growing cover crops? What is your experience? That's going to be a factor. And then what is the exact makeup of your soil? To what degree does it have the clay content? And that can go from muck soil all the way down to when you get into more of a balanced soil of silty clay loam. So then the cropping history. And have you had weather that's been favorable? Let's face it. Let's just be honest. We're all promoting cover crops on here, but some years do not give you the opportunity that other years give you. And I think that is missing sometimes in some of our talks that we give, that cover cropping is all about being an opportunist. And when that time comes that you can get get a cover crop in the ground in a good timely manner, when you have maybe a nice fall that the cover crop can grow and roots can go down deep. If that opportunity is given to you, then you want to be able to exploit that and use that. I mean, we kind of got a classic example here. Large portions of the country, cover crops went in late last fall. And again, large portions of the country are still cold and wet. Cover crops have not reached their potential in the past 6 months like they will some years. And I think we just need to acknowledge that. That being said, a little helps. So we may not get big cover crop growth to work with this spring on a lot of areas. But that being said, we have something there, those of us that have planted, and you never know what the spring's going to give you. So if you don't have it planted in the fall, you'll never get that opportunity. So being an opportunist is always important. So heavy clay soils are typically wet, and I'll just show this picture here that kind of depicts that, what we may see, and I'm sure there's a lot of fields right now look just like that. And we're going to try to, how can we mitigate standing water? How can we dry out our fields a little bit quicker? How can we build resilience into the soil? Well, you guys know the answer. It's using cover crops and also, where possible, less tillage or no tillage. And again, depending on where your soil's at, and I always got to say, where is your level of experience? Where is your level of expertise? Where is your level of knowledge on how your soils work? That's just really, really important, and being able to do the proper management methods on the soil that you happen to manage. And, you know, if you're a crop consultant or a seed salesman, anything like that, knowing and understanding the type of soil is important. And some of you are tired of hearing me say this, but you gotta have a shovel. You have to dig the soil. You have to see how it's reacting. I would say right now, if even today or as soon as you can, to go out and just look at a soil where it's cover cropped and where it's not. What does it look like? What is the difference? Can you show other farmers the difference that it's making? Can you just learn for yourself what those cover crops are doing in your soil? That's the kind of thing that you have to do to be able to become an expert of that. And again, just what are you trying to achieve with your situation? What is your challenge? This is a picture here of a farmer in south central Pennsylvania, and his whole idea of planting these big cover crops here is to dry out his low ground, which is that heavier clay type soil. So here's a point you can jot down. He's waiting till later to plant these. He's allowing the cover crop to dry out the heavy clay soil. He's using the cover crop to accomplish what he's trying to do here, and it's really getting the soil dried out. Now, I'll just say, again, when it comes down to being an opportunist and managing it, if there would be a abnormally dry spring, you would want to terminate this cover crop sooner so it doesn't take moisture away from your cash crop. So again, that's a management issue that you would want to employ there. But by and large, areas where there's a lot of moisture, this is a tactic to be able to use the cover crop as a drying agent, if you will. And then I do know that where this is Bob Peckman, where he lives, is it tends to, as normal, go through a 2 to 3 to 4 6-week drought during the summer or without rain. Now that cover is going to also help him retain moisture in the soil. But even when you have an ideal situation like you're seeing here, and I can promise you it's not going to be this nice every year. When you have this, you're gonna build up a lot of soil quality, of soil health into that system, that it can build it up where you can then experience more resilience later on. Soils have been beat to death typically over time, And we're trying to build them up now with our crop rotation, diversity of species, and no disturbance. So it's a thing that we may not have thought we could have done this kind of stuff before. And that's why I'm showing you this picture here with a field day. This is actually fairly local to me at Penn State Extension, where they have a research farm. And I remember when I started no-till back in the 80s, but I started talking about it in the 90s. And the research manager for this farm, I can distinctly remember because it impacted me, because I kind of looked up to him because, he was the researcher, for agronomy type crops. And he said, I like what you're doing, Steve, down there in them rolling hills where you live, but it doesn't work here. Our clay content's too high and we're not as well drained, and basically patting on my back saying, good job, but thank you very much, doesn't work. Well, when a new manager showed up, when he retired, somehow they found out that it worked. And that just comes down to understanding the principles of cover cropping and no-till. And I put this picture in there to tell that story, but the man in the middle with his back to us, I should have got a better picture, I guess, but that is actually the Pennsylvania Secretary of Agriculture. And I put that in there to kind of make a point here. And he is, his name is Russell Redding, and he's very much on board with cover cropping, no-till, and all that. So to see this evolution of thought, if you will, of what we thought, I'll just say, couldn't be done, now it's being promoted at an academic level and from a political level. So there's two things going on there that I think is, I just feel that it's just a good sign of our times. It validates what we're talking about in this group. And that is a farm that there is a heavier clay soil. Not the heaviest clay around, but it's heavier clay where they said it wouldn't work. So let's talk a little bit practical here. What are some of the species that are probably thought of as the best for heavy clay soils? And I'll just say a little caveat here. This is if you can get them planted in a timely fashion. This list is not exclusive here, and I would really like those of you to be thinking about, or if you want to type in the chat box, you can. What other species would you add here? I'm going to go down over them and just briefly say why they are some of the best for heavy clay soils. And I think you'll know the first two are the deep rooters, radishes and annual ryegrass. They're the ones that get down, and they will eventually help with drainage to be able to help drain the soil. And their radish maybe is a little weak on waterlogged soils, but again, that's why I say you got to be an opportunist. And when it works, when the weather is right, radish does really good. Annual ryegrass as well goes down very deep roots. Now, I listed sorghum sudan here, and I'm going to talk about this again a little later. I won't say much now, but if the summertime, let's say you had a prevent plant situation, sorghum sudan is really good. Those roots are also very impressive. But I listed Phacelia here, and you might wonder, those of you who know anything about Phacelia, it's certainly not a deep rooter. But the place for Phacelia in heavy clay soils is when you get a chance to plant that late summer, even early spring, if there's a window that opens up for that, it really helps remediate soil that has been worked too wet or that has been beaten up. And typically we see that to be a problem in heavy clay soils. They were worked too wet, or especially the wet spots. You're going to plant the whole field. You just want to get her done, get it in there. And some of that field may have been too wet, or you just forced the issue and went in a little bit too wet. Phacelia can really help remediate the top portion of the soil. It's not a deep rooter. It's I'm talking about the top 4 inches or so. There's just something about that. And I want to mention yellow blossom sweet clover because I was trying to think, well, I didn't have any legumes there, and legumes are not necessarily noted to be aggressive deep rooters. I would put yellow blossom sweet clover in there as maybe one of the best. And if you ever saw it someplace, I know it kind of grows wild, but it's almost looks like an alfalfa. So if you can get yellow blossom sweet clover planted in a heavier clay soil, I think that's one of the better options for that situation. I'm going to talk about some other ones later, but that's the ones I wanted to mention now. Since Phacelia is somewhat new for a lot of us, I just want to show you a picture. It kind of looks like a fern. It's a non-legume broadleaf. That's just how the top looks, just so you recognize it. But when you look at what it does to the soil, wow, it's just incredible what those fine roots are there. You can see and what it does for soil aggregation. And I've learned about it in Europe, and it's one of the top 5 cover crops used in Europe. And one of the reasons I think it is they still do a lot of tillage in Europe, and this is one that helps remediate the detrimental effects of tillage. I pretty much want to have Phacelia a pound or so in all the mixes that it makes sense for me anytime from September into October here in southeastern PA. But that's one that's, if you have a pretty beat up soil that's been worked too wet, if you can get that planted, that's going to be one that'll really work well for you. Okay, now going into more of an equipment side of things and some tactics and getting things planted. A lot of times the soil's wet, just too wet to plant, or it's too sticky because of the high clay content. I want to talk about freeze seeding. Freeze seeding is a method that we're going to be planting through lightly frozen ground. And in this picture here, there was a little bit of snow. As you can see, I've done this in the very late fall, early winter, and the very late winter periods of time. And it actually not every year may provide this opportunity, but in the fall, late fall, we could put like cereal rye in because that's tough enough. It's gonna hang around. If you get late enough, you can actually plant annual ryegrass in December, and that's been working pretty good. It's a tough little seed. You won't see it till later on in late winter, early spring. Or you can do this in the spring with spring oats or peas, early spring, of course. But this is just a way to be able to get into those heavy clay soils so that it just doesn't gum up your planter. And you can actually do it and clog up your seed boots. And any of you have done this, it's frustrating when you're out there. Now you notice this picture here, how it was taken at night. And that's because that was when it was fit to plant. I also here, watch out for those wet spots. This is a little wet spot I went through one time. So, if you have some deep wet spots, you don't want to sink your tractor, but you want to be aware of them. There's only so much, of course, that the frost is going to take. So it's you have to wait for the ideal time for this to occur. All that being said, this is very strategic, and it's like you watch the temperature. And you might have to go out in the field and see how frozen the ground is. Sometimes you can wait till the morning and plant till the sun comes up and it starts melting off or whatever. So I'll just tell you a quick story. I started at 11 p.m. once, and the temperature was dropping quickly. And by 2 a.m. I had to stop because the colders were starting to pop up out of the ground because it was frozen too much. So again, just an idea of a tactic especially when you're working heavy clay soils. So another aspect I want to cover here is interseeding. And if you're interested in interseeding, I have 2 or 3 topics. Go back and look at them. They're there. I'm not going to talk about the concept of interseeding. I'm just going to say this is an option here. And I just want to mention it. In areas where you may not be able to get a cover crop planted because your season's short, you're farther in the north. I will just say right off the bat that interseeding is for probably your poor yielding fields. High yielding fields who struggle to keep the seeds alive underneath there, I'll just make that quick comment. But on the areas north of Interstate 80, northern Pennsylvania, New York State, out through Wisconsin, Michigan, into Minnesota and Iowa, those areas, the interseeding is working up into Canada. So it seems like the northern latitudes, it works better. And we think one of the reasons is that there's longer daylight. There's actually more light that gets in there. And I know this year, I know there's some people on the call here that are actually going to be using light meters and trying to figure out what the effect is. But this is just some examples from central New York State. On the right, you see what was interseeded. This would have been after corn silage came off. So this was back I think it was the middle of November. And they actually had a pretty good fall. I actually took this in 2015, a couple years ago. And actually where they drilled it wasn't bad either, but you could see how much advancement they got there in the growth. And I wanted to mention too, because a lot of dairy country that this covers, and this farmer was just tickled to death to be able to spread manure, a drag line in this case, and he wasn't mucking up the soil. Usually in the fall, they're just mudding it in. And because the cover crop was growing, not only did it take up the nitrogen right away, but it supported the tractor better. And it's just really cool when it works out this way. Now, this would have been a interseeding situation with corn silage. If you look close, you can see that. And there's some really large operations in that area and further north and west that are making this work. I will say, though, it hasn't worked every single time, but in the northern areas, they're looking at above a 75% success rate and trying to fine tune it to make the success rate be more consistent. But this is an area, this is definitely heavy clay soils, and they struggle to get in the ground sometimes because of that fact. So just something they might want to consider there. So another area that I want to cover here is in a prevent planting situation. There are some times where it's just too wet to plant. Usually it's because of wet. A few times it's because it's too dry, where you can't plant. And so then it gets too late to plant corn or soybeans. So then it's like, well, what do you do? Well, it's obvious. You're going to plant a cover crop because you have plenty of time. And so this is one of those opportunities I was telling you about. If the unfortunate circumstance happens that you can't get a crop planted in the spring, let's just take this opportunity to take a deep breath and say, I'm really going to hit my cover crops hard. And so I have a few things here, suggestions here. If the planting window is fairly early, which it usually is in this situation, you want to use radishes. That's going to help create drainage. Also, oats for forage, or for more ground cover in the spring if that's what you're going for. And I just put that in there because there are some of us who are getting more into animals. I'm starting to mention that more, kind of as an aside. It seems like there's more interest in putting animals back in the land. And we got time then to plant things like sun hemp, but sorghum Sudan is going to be a go-to. When you want sorghum Sudan, that's the aggressive grower in the summer and its roots grew down deep. And you can mix a couple of these together. And I see Dan has mentioned in the chat here about sunflowers. Good point, Dan, on that. You're exactly right. So that's just some of the more popular ones. And I do want to hear some of you add some more to this later on, or you can put them in the chat there if you want, because these are some of the ones I feel are more of the more popular ones and more important and so forth. But I also wanted to share something that I kind of discovered a couple years ago that to keep in mind. And this is kind of rare, but after quite a bit of thinking and testing and so forth, we had this situation where there were straight radishes planted on a prevent plant situation. And I wouldn't say this is the heaviest clay, but it was definitely ground that did not dry out enough to get planted just radishes. Okay, it's important you know that. The next year, corn was planted, and you see this classic symptom here. Now, some of you smart Alex will say that's pioneer corn. I get that. because Pioneer tends to throw some purplish leaves. But that's not the case here. I'll just check that one off for you right away. But obviously looks like phosphorus deficiency. But the field tests showed at this stage, as we did some testing, that there was decent amount of phosphorus there. And, we know early on sometimes phosphorus is not as available, but it shouldn't have shown this bad. But we came to a conclusion, and I can't say if it's 100% accurate, but we came to the conclusion that since it was a wet spring the previous year, to the point where there's actually water standing in some of this area, and then we planted radishes, mycorrhizae needs, I'll just say this, mycorrhizae does not do well when it's saturated for long periods of time with water. It can literally kill it off. And mycorrhizae is an important function in a fungi in the soil that actually takes phosphorus and helps transport it into the plant. So our final theory on this was mycorrhizal populations were knocked down hard. We planted radishes, which are a non-host for mycorrhizae. We weren't able to resuscitate it, if you will. Planted corn in there, and hence the phosphorus deficiency appearance. That's the conclusion that several agronomists and we came to in this situation. How could have we avoided that? We could have simply just put a little oats with it, or sorghum sedum, which is a mycorrhizal host, and I think that would have remedied this problem. So this is a case for mixes, but it's also to tell you that if here's a combination here, heavy clay soil, wet, you can't plant. Don't just plant radishes, because you may have you're kind of adding to, you're not subjecting the opportunity like you should of rebuilding the mycorrhizae part of the equation here. So that's another case for mixes. So something I feel that was important to share, that is going to be helpful. Hey, regardless if this occurs or not, planting mixes over the summer to me is a no-brainer. You're always going to do it. There's some options there as discussed. Well, if things go a little bit later for whatever reason, there's some other options over here to plant. And I just put on the left-hand side there during the middle part of August, the middle part of September. And I'll just say that radish and phacelia, top and bottom, they undoubtedly will winter kill in most areas. Maybe not south of I-70, depending where you're at, or in the southern states, they probably won't. Crimson clover and hairy vetch, though, I put an asterisk there because you need to understand when you plant them earlier than we normally do, and if they grow over about a foot tall, they may winter kill. So if you're a farmer and you're excited about planting something early and you were counting on an overwintering hairy vetch or crimson clover, because they put a lot of growth on, they almost smother themselves out over the winter in an area that typically they do survive. So it's something to keep in mind. And then our other planting dates here on the right-hand side, I put in, you can see them there. I have a question mark for radish. Should probably put a question mark for phacelia. It depends where you're at, how late you can go on them. But these are just some crops that are good. No strangers here to any of you, but just some crops that you can put in the ground during those planting periods if you're really trying to help your soil out. I've heard this several times where you have a wet spot in your field and for whatever reason you never got anything planted. Well, definitely you go in there with a nice cover crop mix in the summer, get some deep rooting action, and this happens sometimes where you can actually see a second year effect or almost a forever effect, that it opens up channels either to more effectively drain into tile or simply just drain the field. So no guarantees that you're going to transform swamps into highly productive farmland, but I have seen and heard this working. I've heard many, many experiences of farmers. They get a good cover crop and they can see a multi-year effect after that in wet areas. And that is going to depend from area to area. There's a whole lot of variables to that, but something that, again, if you have the opportunity, don't waste it. That if you have growing time in the late summer, don't waste it. I'm wrapping up here, so get your questions ready. But this was a prevent plant in Iowa in I believe it was 2013, if I recall right. And this is kind of what I'm talking about here. As you can see, there's some tillage done there, but they were taking advantage of this. But another instance I want to just show you here is these radishes really do good for opening up the soil. And again, this is actually from Iowa here. But I want to remind you to mix something else with the radishes. And there's several different options out there. The other thing, just to touch on a little different aspect, I wanted to mention strip tillage, because strip tillage is used more so in the heavy clay type soils, just because it takes more management to no-till in those soils and so forth. So here's a strip till rig that's actually has a Valmar seeder on it, where he is actually seeding cover crops on the strips as he's planting. And here is how that field looks in the spring. I think that's pretty cool to see technology like this, and how different options out there. So don't know the history in this field, but I just wanted to put that out there for anyone who it may be helpful. Or here is a solid seeded cover crop. Looks like cereal rye. Someone sent me this picture. I'm not sure what it is, but they're going in and stripping it in the spring. In this case here, they liked it because it helped dry their field out a little quicker, and then they wanted to go back in with their strip tillage. So I'll just say one quick thing. If you're doing this, you got to have a stripper that's capable of making decent berms, because of the root mass you're working with. That could be a challenge. So part of the challenge is that can come along with that. And here is my final picture. I wanted to use this to show what I feel is possible. This is from Dan DeSutter in Indiana. And it's not that he has the heaviest of clay soils is the reason I put this here, but I think this is the result that you can expect if you have no-till and a good cover cropping program. Those upper two left fields were well managed for many years, and you have the other fields there that are conventional till, but they do have draining. Now this is July the 22nd when this was taken in 2015, a very wet year. But I thought this is a good summary slide, because I think it's a realistic expectation under a well-managed system of what you can expect. And granted, I don't like to put timelines, how long will it take to do this, because there's way too many variables to predict that. But that's why I say well-managed, and then you got to catch some breaks from the weather. I can't overemphasize that enough. Things do have to work in your favor sometimes to be able to maximize the potential. So with that, I'm going to unmute everybody. I would like to hear some comments from you, questions, comments, what species did I miss, and that kind of thing. So who has the first comment or question? Go ahead. Who has the first one?
I have a question, Steve.
Go ahead.
I'm in northern North Dakota, and the frost cheating intrigues me because we don't have a long enough season to do get a lot of cover crop growth behind wheat. Mm-hmm. So is there any other species, you mentioned ryegrass, but is there any other species that anybody's had success with on frost season?
Well, I use the term freeze seeding. You mean planting through frozen ground, lightly frozen ground, right? That's what you're referring to, right?
Correct.
Cereal rye, I mentioned, if you're wheat country, you probably don't want to hear that one. I get that. And the same maybe for annual ryegrass, maybe that's why you're asking for other options. I don't know if you're open to hairy vetch or not, but later on in December, we're getting some pretty strong varieties now that there's some varieties of hairy vetch that'll work. You have to think about the tough seeds. I've tried peas in December and they just rot. I figured it would, but so you're going to go with the tough little seeds. So think about that. in that aspect. And that's why annual ryegrass works well. Of course, cereal rye, I could add triticale in there too. A lot of them varieties would stand it. Crimson clover, again, doesn't seem to have the toughness of the seed to carry over in a situation like that. So, any suggestions from anybody else? Maybe people from the northern climates that would be able to chime in on another option? Any other suggestions? I would say talk to some. I know there's like a North Dakota club or whatever that's kind of like borders Canada and North Dakota. That I don't know if you know about that or not, but that might be something you want to look into, Nathan, to have some discussions on maybe trying some things like that.
Yeah, the Mandak Zero Till Association went belly up here last year, which
bummer.
They were great. That was Manitoba and North Dakota. And
well, there's actually another one. I'll write it down here. Maybe I can. I know I can't think of it off the top of my head now. They've been doing some research. I know that it's actually for northern North Dakota. It sounds like that's where you're from.
Yes.
So I'm jotting that down here. Maybe I can dig that up and see if I can put you in touch with those people. Okay. Well, that's great question. Other comments, other questions here on our topic today? Anybody?
Steve, this is Marty. Wondering about putting vetch with cereal rye. Mm-hmm. Does it nodulate enough to give you nitrogen credit the following year for corn?
My experience of hairy vetch and cereal rye, and I'll just say I have over 20 years experience with it. It really does help the rye. Of course, it shares a little bit. But the rye will take up a lot of what it produces. It depends sometimes in the ratio, but let's just say for the sake of your question, we'll just say it's about well, when I say 50-50, that doesn't really equate to seeding rates, but let's just say plant for plant. It's about 50-50. Yes, there will be a net gain of nitrogen that you can credit some. But then again, it really depends when you're terminating it, because if the rye is terminated late, it's not going to give much, if any, at all back in time for corn. If it's terminated earlier on, the rye is going to give you a little nitrogen in July or August, but the vetch won't have fully matured to its potential. So, there's some trade-offs there, and when you're terminating it. I grow hairy vetch and rye as a foundation for a couple species for my pumpkins. And I usually credit about 40 pounds from a hairy vetch rye, but that's in bloom and not just first bloom. That's in half bloom or more. So I'm crediting at 40 pounds at that stage. Now, it's adding to my overall pool of nitrogen even for later on, because a lot of times I'll come back with wheat. And it seems like I don't need any nitrogen in the fall at all to get that wheat over all the way into maybe a side dress application in the spring. So that's been my experience in that. I don't know if anybody else has any comments on that or experience or not. Anyone else work with hairy vetch and rye? Okay. I know that we have Bob Betts on from Western New York State and also Erie, Pennsylvania area. Bob, I don't know if you want to comment on your situation. Bob is actually grows wine grapes. He has vineyards, and just talking to him before we came on here, and I said, do grapes even grow in heavy clay soils? And he said most of his farm is that. So I'm learning new stuff all the time. So do you have any comments here, Bob, for what we talked about today, or just some comments?
Well, we grow Concord grapes. That's mainly for juice and jellies, okay, and also wine. Okay. But I raise grain rye and red clover and peas. Okay. In some of my covers.
Okay.
And the 2 years I let it grow up to roll crimpet, it was dry.
Oh.
So dry that I probably hurt a little bit. Okay. The very first year it was wet. So it did help dry my ground out quite a bit.
Okay. So I alluded to that during my presentations, that if it gets dry, you may terminate a little sooner. Is that correct?
Well, I'm learning that.
Yeah, we're all learning, but yeah, that's typical. Yeah.
What about compaction and soil?
Go ahead, Jackie. Right? Go ahead. What's your question?
Yeah, this is Jackie. I'm an extension agent. I was just going to say that we did some TDR probing for our soil compaction with and without cover crops, and in the clays we really noticed it did a lot of good in terms of breaking up that compaction by the tractor tires, and the harvesters that we use to pick the grapes are pretty heavy too. So that sort of benefit can't go unnoticed as well.
Oh wow. Well, that's going to transfer into agronomic crops. So I'm not surprised you said that, but that's always nice to verify what we think is going on in theory. So that's cool. Jackie, do you have any more comments on our talk today? I know this isn't directed specifically to growing grapes, but a lot of the principles I'm assuming carry over.
Yeah, no, I think this is great information, especially about getting out there with a shovel and making sure you're visually appraising what's going on, because that's the only way to really know is to get out in your fields and check it out. So
yeah. So I'm not sure if I'm saying this right, but Kabir from UC or the NRCS in Davis, California. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this or not. I'm just checking. You might have some. Yeah, go ahead, Kabir.
No, I think I don't have much experience with this heavy soil, but I did work in at Penn State,
right.
the research station you're talking about.
Okay.
And I did a couple of cover crops work over there, and oats, rye, and on that soil. And also I did with the buckwheat and I think it was winter wheat.
Okay.
But all of them works pretty good. I didn't have any issue with the germinations and also we didn't apply any phosphorus in there for following crop like sweet corn was growing, and they're growing pretty good.
Okay. Good. Any other comments? I'm gonna kind of open it up here for any cover crop question there is, but I'm just gonna put up here next week's webinar. Look at that picture there. I hope this isn't the case, but I have a list of topics, 4 or 5 ahead, but sometimes I gotta go to what's relevant, and just knowing where we're headed here. There's going to be a lot of wet fields, and I thought, well, let's talk about that next week. So next week we're going to talk. The title I gave it was Keys to Adapting to Mother Nature's Timetable, and we're going to focus again a little bit more. And it's you could say it's a little related to today's topic, and yeah, it is. But I want to hone in a little bit more. What are we going to do here? How do we make management decisions with cover crops when they haven't grown as much as they have? When do you decide how dry? Is it dry enough to go ahead and plant? So I'm going to tackle some of those questions next week. I just want to let you know that. But for the rest of our time here, what other cover crop questions might you have? Any cover crop questions at all that you've been thinking about this past week or whatever? I see Brent's asking here about a webinar for light soils. Yeah, I got that down, Brent. That's good. That's going to come up. And on that note, I'll take any other suggestions you have. I want to put out on Facebook and on email here to invite suggestions for topics, just so we're making sure I'm not forgetting something. But thanks for that, Brent. But yeah, any questions at all from anyone on anything on cover crops?
Yeah, Steve, I guess I have a question.
Hi,
we had been talking. How you doing? Hey, we've been talking about black oats for a while.
Oh, yeah.
What are you seeing with black oats? Can we do it here in the spring and maybe get a crop off before we plant tobacco, or are we pushing our luck? Of course, it's a late spring.
Okay, just for the rest of you know, Herb is my neighbor, so I'll talk to you as a neighbor here, Herb. I did plant 4 acres for another neighbor, so we'll see how that goes. That's intended to be before squash are planted in the middle of June, so we can watch that. Last year I did a couple different fields of black oats, and I would say if that's going to be done, we got to do that this week in order to be worthwhile. So if that's the idea for some of these guys that want to have tobacco, they're going to want to no-till the tobacco into the black oats, I'm assuming?
Either way, either plow it down or work it up, and either way. I'm just wondering if we have enough time to get oats in here now and get a cover crop off.
Well, I look at the calendar and it's April the 10th, and it feels like March the 10th. But that's going to change this weekend for us. But then, not sure what the next 2-week forecast is. But all that being said, we're starting to run out of time for that to be worthwhile. Is my straight up answer. That's why I said if you can get it in this week yet, and maybe we can get it germinated this weekend, I would mix 40, 50 pounds of peas with it, unless there's a lot of manure on that ground, just to help it along as well.
With black oats, with the little more cold tolerant, that would be a better choice than, and maybe planted early, be a better choice than regular forage oats?
I don't think that cold tolerance makes any difference anymore.
Okay.
I don't think I don't think there's an advantage that I'm aware of, unless you're talking forage. There could be a forage advantage to black oats. They seem to be looking really good, but that's all I'll say on that. They seem to be looking really good if that's something that they're trying to do.
Okay.
So
very good.
Yeah. Other questions? Go ahead, Brent.
On intercropping, I'm looking at doing 10 acres of intercropped cover crops into my non-GMO corn. I'm looking to drill about 10 acres with a John Deere 750 drill just before the corn emerges.
Okay. And
also overseed or just spin on another 10 acres at about V3 or 4 when the corn is up. Do you have any recommendations on a mix that would work here in north central Iowa to outcompete weeds and promote mycorrhizal fungi growth and to come up and look nice after the corn is harvested and to provide weed control for the 2019 beans?
Boy, you're asking a lot there, Brent. You're asking a lot. but
you ask.
That's right. No, I would say that go slow on that. I do know of some of that stuff being tried. I'm keeping on monkeying around with it. The trick is the first thing you had mentioned there about drilling after planting. I know some guys have tried subterranean clover because it tends to be low growing. It's a nitrogen producer. I've heard of the white ladino type clover, again, low producer. And it doesn't have as deep of a root that hopefully the corn will get a hold. But the big concern is if you would happen to have a dry May or dry early June, boy, that corn is just going to be competing directly with your cover crops. So that's that, and maybe it's just about assuming the risk that this may be, and that's why I said go slow. I mean, 10 acres is small to you. That's great. As far as the V3, anything from there and later, what we have seen in our interseeding work is we go down to about V3 and we don't seem to have any corn yield hits. Now, a yield hit, it's one thing if it's 5 bushel, it's another thing if it's 25 bushel. And I would say it this way, your risk is going to be higher with the species planted early. And I listed some suggestions as far as coming in there at V3. Then the popular ones are annual ryegrass, crimson clover, and radishes. That seems to be the most popular. There's hairy vetch sometimes thrown in there, and there's now some cowpeas, and there's other crops. There's quite a few that are being tried. None of them that I could tell you are kind of rising to the top with consistency. Just because you hear of someone who was successful one year with a cover crop species and interseeding doesn't mean it's going to work everywhere. We know that, but I'm just reminding us of that. So I would say it's fine for you to try that, Brent, but And then if it works this year, will it work next year? I'm just trying to be straight up with you. What I've tried, what I've known other people tried. But I will say this, in the context of what we all are collectively learning, I think we need to keep fiddling around with this kind of stuff because we know that there's synergies among various plant species when they grow together. It just happens to be, we pay our bills by growing a cash crop, whatever that may be. So at the end of the year, that's going to have to pencil out. I'm really liking some of these suggestions on some of these companion cropping where we're actually growing multiple cash crops together. And that's another topic for another day, because then it's kind of your different approach. But in order not to inhibit your cash crop too much, but also to reap the benefits you may get, that's a pretty fine line. Some things are out of our control at this point. I would say if you have irrigation, then the risk is a lot lower. There's some Cura clover that has been used and studied in, I believe, Wisconsin or Michigan. That's kind of more of a perennial situation that people were trying to do that. I know that Pennington Seed at one time had a certain clover that they were trying to do some of this stuff with, where they're just spraying out like a narrow band. I'm not sure where that's at now, but I think you can see it on their website. So that might be some things for you to look into, Brent. Am I answering your question or am I missing it?
Yeah, no, that's great. All those things that I understand, I think it might turn out to be a two-step system. If we can get something growing low under the corn canopy that will hang out there, and then maybe come back and either broadcast in with a Hagee at when the corn's drying down or when the corn is harvested, come back and drill in like a cereal run along with whatever we had early.
Yeah. Yeah, the biggest risk is going to be the earlier planted stuff right before corn emergence. And I know you're trying to help it compete with weeds, but boy, that, it depends on your field history, a lot of factors there. So, other questions from anybody? Any cover crop question? Any comments?
Hi, I have a question from the UK. It's George.
Oh, I didn't notice you were on today. Oh, welcome aboard. Yeah. Go ahead.
It's actually quite similar to the last question. We're growing corn or maize on 20-inch rows. We've got a front bar that we can sow at the sort of 6 to 8 leaf stage. We can sow between the maize, so it's a similar question to the previous one. We don't struggle for water, and we don't get that hot here, so maize out competing the inter-row for water is never really an issue. We're on very heavy clay soils, but there's not much of this done in Europe. Our main reason for wanting to do it is actually when they forage the corn, reducing the damage caused at harvest. So I want to try and make the tractors and trailers run on green and not on the soil. And people are saying try Italian ryegrass, but I'm not sure what to put in between the rows, and I'm very nervous about how that might impact the biomass we produce as well.
Well, when you say Italian ryegrass, I know there's different types of ryegrasses, and I'm not sure which are all available in the UK. But that, we usually just identify it as annual ryegrass. That seems to be one of the most popular ones because it actually does a pretty good job at what you're trying to achieve. You're trying to build soil structure to mitigate any damage created by the heavy harvesting equipment. So, and that was in the middle part of my presentation when I mentioned that annual ryegrass, crimson clover, and radishes tend to be the three popular crops. The radishes help to open up the soil later on, and the crimson clover gives you some nitrogen production there. So when I was over in Belgium here about 3 weeks ago, I saw they were testing some of that in Belgium, and I believe that even might have been 20-inch corn now, but they were actually doing a little different roundabout. They were planting wheat. No, they planted, they planted a white, like a low-growing white clover, and that was successful, and then they planted wheat into it. and they wanted that clover to survive on the understory of the wheat. So that was pretty novel idea there. So I don't know. Yeah. I'm giving you some roundabout answers there, but so you actually do have equipment that you be able to put the seed in the ground, or are you just broadcasting the seed between your 20-inch rows?
No, well, as you probably know, we build equipment as well, so I've got the luxury of being able to tinker with things. But we've got some like long drop disc culters where we can get in reasonably tall crops. I'm hoping the establishment.
Good. Well, just a quick question. If you're able to post any of those pictures on the Facebook page, that would be really neat for the rest of us to see what you're doing.
Yeah, I'll do that. Yeah, I'm a new member, so
well, welcome aboard. We'd be glad to see what you're doing in that. So great.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? Got time for like one more question if you guys have it. Any other question? Okay. If not, thanks again for your attention. I appreciate all the questions that come up, and you guys have a great week. Hopefully things will warm up and dry out, and we'll plan to see you next week.